Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Let me get back first to where I had ended in the previous lecture, and the point there was the nature of phenomenal consciousness. The very notion of consciousness is being broadly divided into two categories: intentional consciousness, or conscious states with the property of intentionality, and phenomenal consciousness or conscious states with the property of qualia. So qualia and phenomenology are interrelated. If a mental state has a specific phenomenology, then it has a specific qualia. And any experiential mental state has a phenomenology. Phenomenology, in fact, signifies or means experientiality. That is to say, experience has the character of a specific feel. And the peculiarity of phenomenal consciousness is that since it is the feel of a state of experience, or state, a conscious state, that feel is intrinsic to a given state. That feel is not something that you can account for in relational terms. So in a way, in regard to the theory of functionalism, to the extent that we have found functionalism failing to capture the intrinsic qualitative content of certain mental states, experiential mental states, to that extent we could now say that when it comes to a more overall or complete grasp of mental states, one must take into consideration both these facts, namely that a mental state is a functional state, and at least some mental states have, in addition to their functional role, they also have a particular feel in the very nature, in the very essence of those states. So function and phenomenology, function and feel, these two are quite different, and a satisfactory theory of mental states, satisfactory theory of mind, cannot fail to account for both. So far it has so happened that because of the methodologically objective orientation, the given theory, such as functionalism, only accounts for the functional character of the mental state. The phenomenological character is left out. And that point, what is left out, what is not being captured, that point has created in recent philosophy a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion and a lot of new theoretical exploration. So some critical points about that dimension of phenomenal consciousness now needs to be talked about. I would consider a particular philosophical account of subjectivity to be quite central in this connection, and that happens to be the account provided by a famous philosopher named Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel had argued in a very famous paper called What It Is Like to Be a Bat. The argument of that paper is about the very nature of subjective experience, the subjectivity of conscious experience. But he makes a general point first about what a conscious being is, what it is to be a conscious being at all, like us or other animals. And the general point, which one could say is a point about creature consciousness. That means what it is like to be, or what it is to be a creature which has consciousness, say a creature endowed with consciousness. In short, what is creature consciousness? Now, this expression, creature consciousness, may be distinguished from what is called state consciousness. That means a particular mental state can be a conscious mental state. In that regard, it would be described as state consciousness. So creature consciousness and state consciousness are two different characterizations of conscious subjectivity. But they are, of course, interrelated because one is a subset of the other. Namely, there will be state consciousness only if that state is a state of a conscious creature. That means any state consciousness will presuppose creature consciousness. However, the description of these two types of consciousness would vary, although there would be a relation between the two. Creature consciousness would be defined like this. For some creature, for any creature to be a conscious creature, to be a creature with consciousness, there has to be something it is like for that creature to be that creature. In other words, if I'm talking about a creature like a dog, which of course has consciousness, then to be a dog, a conscious dog, a living conscious dog, is for there to be something which it is like for the dog to be what it is. So something that it is like for a given creature to be what it is, that is a very, very, in a way, very, very opaque description. And that opacity needs to be rendered into at least a relatively transparent description. And one can do that in this rather rough way. Let's now come back to the human organism case, the conscious creature that we humans are. So if a human individual is a conscious creature, then that individual has a sense of, has a conscious awareness of being an individual of a certain kind. There's a kind of feeling of being the creature that one is. And in a way, it's very obvious, because it just follows from the fact of being aware of being alive. Okay? So creature consciousness really boils down to that very, very fundamental awareness of just being alive, being that very conscious creature. So this awareness is what is meant by conscious awareness. Now, if I have that sense of being a conscious creature, I mean, sense of being aware of being alive, it also means that my life, my living existence, my life in the condition in which I am alive, there are many states, conscious states, that I have or that I undergo. And there is a particular awareness of having those particular conscious states, whether the conscious state is a conscious belief, a conscious desire, a conscious intention, a conscious supposition, a conscious sense of despair, conscious hope. These are examples of state consciousness, or conscious pain, conscious awareness of something perceptual like taste, sight, etc. Okay. Now, when it comes to state consciousness, if I am in any of these conscious states, then for me there is something it is like to be in that conscious state. So take the conscious visual state, let's say seeing something green. Okay. Now, that I am in a state of having a conscious, in a state of having a greenish visual experience means what? It means that for me, there is something it is like to be in that state. That means there is a question of what it is like to be in that state. So what it is like, you can turn it into a hyphenated phrase, what hyphen it hyphen is hyphen like. So this is like the description of a property, of a phenomenal property, namely the what it is like property. So this what it is like property is intrinsic to any state of consciousness, any particular state of consciousness, whether it is visual experience or a desire experience or whatever. Okay. And Nagel now says something which has really revolutionized our understanding of consciousness or phenomenal mental states, or consciousness in general. That very title, what it is like to be a bat, why is that sort of a title in place while discussing the nature of consciousness, the subjectivity of consciousness? Well, the point is, just as I said, if I am a human being endowed with consciousness, then I'm aware of being alive as a human being, as a conscious creature. So I know what it is like. I'm aware of what it is like to be a conscious human being. In the very fact of being alive, I'm aware of it. I don't need any kind of extra reflection on it. It is self-manifesting. It is a self-intimating awareness, this what it is likeness of being a conscious creature. Okay? Now, a bat is also a conscious creature, that much we know. But then the question is, do I know what it is like to be a bat in the way I know what it is like to be a human being, the human being that I am? This is a very important question. It may not appear to be a very difficult question, but as a matter of fact, it is a fairly complex question. I mean, it has the appearance of simplicity, but that is a very deceptive appearance of simplicity. It's not simple. Nagel says, I do not know, I cannot know as a human being what it is like to be a bat. What's the argument? The argument is that when you know something, you are aware of something or being something, say a human being, yourself a human being, then there's a particular species-specific point of view, species-specific subjective point of view from which you are aware of your being alive as that creature, that kind of creature. So one could say it's from the human point of view that I know what it is like to be the human individual that I am. That it is from the human point of view I'm aware of being alive as a human entity, human creature. By parity of reasoning, this point about point of view would have to be true of other creatures as well, other conscious creatures as well. So in this case, it has to be true of the creature called bat. Just as there is a human point of view from which I subjectively am aware of being alive, being the creature that I am, there must also be a subjective point of view from which, and only from which, the bat is aware of being a bat. The bat is aware of what it is like to be a bat. Now the question is, the human subjective point of view of creature consciousness and the bat subjective point of view of creature consciousness, are they shareable points of view? The answer is that they are not shareable, because subjective points of view are by definition unshareable. They are first-person points of view. In fact, that's the meaning of subjectivity. So subjectivity entails, the very notion of subjectivity entails the notion of a point of view. Subjectivity is, if you like, by definition, a point of view, a subjective point of view, which is first-personal in nature. And there is one sense in which, of course, a subjective point of view is shareable, but it is shareable only within the same species of creature consciousness. In other words, if I know what it is like to be the human being that I am, the individual human being that I am, you also, as an individual human being, know what it is like for you to be alive, to be the creature that you are, by virtue of the same human point of view. So, in that sense, in this species-specific sense, a subjective point of view is a shared point of view. I mean, it's a common point of view. You have that point of view merely by virtue of the fact that you are an individual human creature, like other fellow individual human creatures. But across species, this subjective point of view cannot be shared. I cannot share the point of view of, subjective point of view of the bat. But why not? Well, I cannot do that because perhaps the structure of subjectivity, or if you like, the configuration of subjectivity, the structure of subjectivity, the inner constitution of subjectivity, in the case of that creature, that species of creatures, namely the bat, is quite different from the configuration or structure or inner constitution of human subjectivity. Now, of course, I am resorting to certain metaphors like configuration, inner constitution, structure, etc., regarding the specification of the nature of subjectivity, and they may strike you as obfuscating. And what does it mean for a particular species of subjectivity, creature conscious subjectivity, to have a certain kind of subjective configuration? What does it mean? What does it mean to have a certain kind of structure? Well, I think that can be spelt out by saying that what lends to me as a human being a certain kind of subjective life is, of course, the kind of consciousness that characterizes my life. Okay? And what's the kind of consciousness that characterizes an individual human life? I mean, what's the kind of character that human consciousness has? Well, the answer would be, of course, one has to give it in rather segmentary way, in terms of different segments. Take the case of the segment of perception. Okay. We have 5 perceptual sensory modalities. Okay. And that's how we have perceptual experience of the world, perceptual encounter with the world, perceptual registering of the environment surrounding us. And given that, we have a certain other kinds of conscious awarenesses, like other feelings, desires, hopes and fears, emotions, and then we have, yeah, so that would be a kind of rough overall description of the configuration of subjectivity, human subjectivity, structure of human subjectivity. Now, when it comes to a creature like a bat, what would be the perceptual configuration or configuration of the perceptual subjectivity of the bat? And it's a fact that bats encounter the world in terms of bat sonar. They have sonar perceptual mode in which they relate themselves to the world, and that makes the configuration of perceptual subjectivity, bat perceptual subjectivity, very different from the configuration of human perceptual subjectivity. And that's a fairly fundamental difference in the nature of subjectivity, because of which the subjective point of view of that creature becomes inaccessible from the human subjective point of view. So Thomas Nagel says that suppose we are trying to grasp what it is like to be a bat. We already know what it is like to be a human being because we are human beings. Now we see other conscious beings, we see the bat, so we make an effort to know what it is like to be a bat, what it is like to experience itself being alive as a bat. And then the first thing we would do, we would like to imagine, we would like to resort to imagination. Okay. So we try to imagine. So what are we going to imagine in this case while trying to understand what it is like to be a bat? The furthest that you can go in engaging in this sort of an imagination would be what it is like for me to be a bat. Somewhat like in another case, simpler case, let's say I am imagining what it is like to be Napoleon, okay, who lost his battle in the Waterloo. In that case, I imagine myself being Napoleon, for me to lose that war. Similarly, in this case, I would imagine what it is like for me to be the bat. But that's not going to work. That's not going to give the answer to the question. Because what would be required, per impossibile, what would be required is being able to imagine what it is like for the bat to be a bat, not for me to be a bat. So this me, the human me, cannot be transferred, or the human me cannot be carried to the space of imagination if there has to be an imaginative success of this, if you like, phenomenological experiment, because we are trying to find out bat phenomenology by capturing the subjective configuration, the subjective point of view of bat consciousness. And that is impossible. And it is this impossibility relates to the fact that subjective points of view are species specific. A bat is a distinct species with its own perceptual phenomenological configuration, fairly different from the subjective phenomenological configuration of human consciousness, consciousness of the human species. Now, why is this point about point of view, this statement about subjective point of view important, and what is its relevance? What is its relevance to our critique of some of the theories that we have just discussed? Those theories which are methodologically objective in their approach, like physicalism and functionalism. I think it should be clear enough what the relevance is. The relevance is this: if you adopt the objective third-person standpoint in your theoretical exploration of any phenomenon, anything, then whatever result you are expecting at the end of the exploration will have to be true, not from any species-specific particular point of view, but it would have to be objectively true. It would have to be third-personally true. It would have to be true irrespective of any such parochial species-specific point of view. That is the spirit of the scientific methodological approach. Take the case of physics as an example of science or scientific investigation. Take the case of a simple object and its properties, how the object is individuated and its properties described from the human perceptual point of view. Well, the object would be described in terms of its solidity, in terms of its resistance to pressure by, let's say, my hand, or in terms of its color, texture, size, etc. But when it comes to a purely physical description of the object in terms of its microstructure, I mean in terms of those concepts which constitute the vocabulary of modern physics, then the description would be completely different from the perceptual description. And from that point of view, from that perspective of science, however the object is described, that description would be true, would have to be true in an objective sense. That means it would be acceptable not just for us, but for any other creature with intelligence. Okay. In other words, the human point of view will be withdrawn, it will be overcome, because that's a very subjective, perceptual, parochial, regional, local point of view. And the scientific point of view is methodologically a move away from the parochial, local, regional experiential point of view into some abstract, more and more abstract general point of view. Okay. So it's the very character of methodological character of objective theories, objectively oriented theories, that it will not be conditioned by a given point of view. So if you apply that kind of approach, theoretical approach, to an understanding of mental phenomena, especially especially mental states of phenomenal consciousness which have qualia or intrinsic qualitative content. And if such states are graspable only from a specific subjective point of view, in that case, the objective exploration will necessarily fail to capture the given subjective nature of the state, because by definition, by its very methodological objective orientation, this approach will not be constrained by that species specific or very specific subjective point of view. That subjective point of view would be left out, methodologically left out. So this is what is happening, whether it is physicalism or functionalism. Because, for example, in physicalism, identity theory, how is a mental state described or identified? It is described as a state of the neural system or brain state. And now, when you say a mental state is a brain state, then the point of view from which the mental state is identified, namely a state of the brain, that neurophysiological point of view is of course a scientific objective point of view. Okay. So there's nothing like there being a property in a physical state which is a property intelligible only from a specific point of view, first person point of view, for example. There's nothing like that. I mean, you don't do science from the first person point of view. You don't do neurophysiology from the first person point of view. Because neurophysiological states, or for that matter any physical states, can only have objective properties. That means properties none of which would be first person properties or properties accessible only from the first person point of view. And that's the subjective point of view. So subjectivity is by definition methodologically left out, or the theory is not even designed to capture subjectivity, because the theory by definition is not constrained by any such subjective point of view. What Nagel is saying is that while theories in their objective orientation are highly successful when it comes to explaining other phenomena, it's not the case with when it comes to explaining mental phenomena, because if mental states are states of phenomenal consciousness, then the subjective point of view is intrinsically connected with the very nature of those given mental states with phenomenal quality, because the phenomenal nature is the subjective nature, and the subjective nature is something that is available only from the subjective first person point of view. So, how can you really provide a satisfactory theory of phenomenal consciousness if your theory is designed to be so rigorously objective? Regarding physicalism, I mean identity theory, there is an argument that attempts to demonstrate that physicalism about mental states is false, and that argument in a way resorts to what has now been said from the standpoint of Nagel's theory, Nagel's explanation of subjectivity, namely the first person character of subjective states, the point of view. And this argument, critical argument, is known as the knowledge argument, proposed by an Australian philosopher called Frank Jackson. What is this argument? It is directed particularly at physicalism. The argument is like this. There is a thought experiment, and the thought experiment is about someone called Mary. Mary has been, in that imagined scenario, in that thought experiment, Mary has been brought up in a completely black and white environment. It could be, I mean, let's say it could be a huge house with no open windows, and the house, the inside of the house is completely black and white. There is no space for any kind of color. Nothing colored is inside the house. No colored object, no color wall, nothing. Okay. And then there is a black and white television and other instruments, you know, maybe computers and books. She has been trained, not just brought up, but trained to be educated, and the specific education that has been imparted to her is later on, of course, at the mature stage, is to become an expert in neurophysiology, let's say. So all the training required to be an expert neurophysiologist is given within the resources of that black and white environment. And then further specialization that is given to her is to become a neurophysiologist, a scientist who has the expertise of color experience. And ex hypothesi, she is so trained that there's nothing that she doesn't know about the facts of color experience. She's almost omniscient about all neurophysiological facts of what color experience is. Now, this remark, all neurophysiological facts about what color experience is, this is a very significant statement, because I'm not saying all knowledge about what color experience is like. I'm not saying that. I'm stopping short of that. What color experience is. The reason why I'm giving this warning at this point is that there is a world of difference between these two phrases. What color experience is and what color experience is like. The addition of the word like makes all the difference. So I shall come to that very soon. Now, let's say she becomes 25 of age and she has become the #1 master neurophysiologist, #1 in color experience. Then suddenly she is released from that black and white environment. And she is into a free world. So she goes out, and what she finds is that surrounding that black and white environment, that house, there is a garden with various flowers of various colors. And then she first encounters a garden of a portion of the garden which is that of red roses, let's say. And someone tells her, probably for the first time, that what you see are roses with the color red. And then she exclaims, "Oh, this is what experiencing red is like. Oh, this is what seeing the color red is like." Okay. Now, she already knew, because she is the best best expert in color experience. So she already knew all the facts about color experience, including red. Now, when she says for the first time, "Oh, I never knew earlier, now I know what experiencing red is like." So that's the difference, that's the transition. She already knows what red experience is. I mean the facts, physical, neurophysiological facts about red experience. But since she never had the exposure to anything colored, including red, this is the first exposure and the first encounter with a red object gives her the first sensory impression, experiential impression. And therefore she says, "Oh, this is what experiencing red is like. This is what seeing red is like." So that like, knowledge of what it is like, has dawned in her for the first time, first moment of her life. Okay. So the question now is, definitely she has gained something because she was earlier not exposed to it. The question now is, has she gained in knowledge? Has she acquired a new kind of knowledge? I mean, the kind of knowledge that she had already acquired before being released is neurophysiological knowledge, or knowledge about physical facts concerning color experience. About probably frequency and then neuron patterns, activation, physicochemical changes, etc., etc., everything. So there is nothing physical or neurophysiological to know about color experience. She already knows them. If she has gained, and if that gain is a gain in knowledge, then that must be another kind of knowledge, not knowledge about physical or neurophysiological facts, but another kind of knowledge, which means knowledge about another kind of fact. Of course, the point is that, yes, she has gained in knowledge, but not knowledge of physical facts, And since it is a new knowledge, knowledge about something, some fact, it has to be knowledge about some non-physical fact, namely the fact of what it is like to see something red, experiential fact, first person knowledge. So, the conclusion of the knowledge argument is that physical knowledge isn't all that there is to know when it comes to a fact of experience, what it is like to see something red. I know what it is like to see something red. That's a knowledge. But this is first person experiential knowledge. It is not knowledge of anything physical. And from that, what follows is that physicalism as a theory of mental states must be false. Because if physicalism were true, then everything that there is to know about a mental state, any given mental state, would be knowledge of physical facts. But then Mary had complete knowledge of physical facts about color experience, and yet she was ignorant of some crucial fact about color experience, or fact about that mental state, experiential mental state. And that could not be provided by physics or physical theory. Therefore, physicalism about a mental state physicalism about a mental state cannot be a complete story of knowledge. So, physicalism about mental states, at least experiential mental states, would be false. It would be false because it claims to say that a mental state is nothing other than only a physical state, a brain state. If it were nothing other than only a brain physical state, then knowing about it would simply amount to knowing about its physical properties. But then a mental experiential phenomenon like color experience has qualia as well, qualitative property, which is accessible only from the first person point of view. You have to have first person knowledge, which is not physical knowledge. That is the knowledge argument. And this knowledge argument is connected with Nagel's argument about point of view, because ultimately what difference is made when Mary is released and enabled to have an encounter with a colored object, what difference that makes is this, that there was a certain point of view only from which she would fully know, I mean fully in the sense of truly essentially know what seeing red is like, and that is of course the first person point of view. She was confined to a mode of third person knowledge, deprived of that first person knowledge or knowledge from the first person point of view. And that deprivation is quite significant, because unless you have knowledge or awareness from the first person point of view, you will not know what such experiential mental states are really like. That means experiential mental states are not just certain mental states about which you know certain facts. You must also know what being in those mental states is like. So what it is like property defines their essence, experiential essence of experiential states, states with qualia. And and physicalism is false because within its theoretical parameter, there is no provision for accounting for this fact of this unique subjective point of view, only through which you have access to qualia. And the same would be true about functionalism. Okay? When you give a causal functional account of an experiential mental state like this color experience, the fact of what it is like to see a red colored rose or a green colored leaf, that fact would of course not be captured in the very third person centered functional description of the mental state. Okay. You would simply give a causal functional relational account of the state, leaving out the fact that it's only from the first person subjective point of view that you will ever come to know what the phenomenology of this otherwise functional state is. So function is taken into account, phenomenology is left out, and that is a serious lacuna, serious deficiency, because without that phenomenology, that state cannot be a color experiential state, no matter even if all the functional descriptions are satisfied by it. So I shall stop here. In the subsequent lecture, I shall go ahead by considering the phenomenological properties of consciousness in such a way that it would eventually lead to the idea of the human subject, the I, the self. Thank you.